answered on the chat box to our speakers with requests that they respond in follow-up. We will be sending out a video of today's call along with bios of all our speakers and a transcription in English as soon as we can. Now I turn the conference over to my colleague, our moderator, Sunita.
I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit more about myself, talking about the law, and then go into the problems that I see with Prop 22, which is frankly the most dangerous labor law that I've seen in my lifetime. So I studied taxi work and taxi workers, which is, an industry that many immigrant men in particular have long gone into over the course of the 20th century. It was an industry that in many cases provided middle-class incomes, sent people to college, allowed people to buy homes. It was primarily a unionized industry until the late 1970s, when taxi companies said that they were no longer going to pay workers, but instead charge them a lease to rent a car, and then in turn get any income that they earned on top of the lease that they paid to take home in their pockets. And so one thing about the taxi industry is that because demand was capped, because there was only a certain number of taxis that could circulate in San Francisco, for example, at any given time, and because fares were regulated by city officials, workers were able to, in most cases and during most economies, at least project or estimate what their income would be.
Could I ask you just to slow down a little bit for the interpreters?
Absolutely.
If don't want to miss a word. Okay.
No, thank you. Sorry about that. So what happened in 2012 was that Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar, which has now gone under, started operating as Francisco. They became very popular services. Regulators created laws to accommodate their business model and allowed them to operate illegally for many months. And for a few years, although taxi workers saw their competition go up and go through the roof, workers were able to rely on it for some source of income, as I'm sure many of you have, because wages stayed high. They stayed high because they were subsidized by venture capitalists, so they were artificially high wages. The companies were losing money just left and right and continue to lose money in providing those wages. And since 2012, wages have just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. So drivers tell me that they make now something like 60% of what they had made in 2012, and this was pre-pandemic estimates. So what happened? So for many years, we saw very little regulation, wide-scale regulation of labor on these platforms, primarily because the companies have so much power. They prevented, through their relationships, through their lobbying, state officials from enforcing any kind of employment laws against them, and from creating any kinds of regulations that would protect workers. So in 2018, the Supreme Court decided a case called Dynamics v. Superior Court of LA that changed the test for who is an employee for purposes of wage orders in California. The result is that it became very clear that it would be difficult for Uber to argue that it was not an employer, because the test said, A, that there is a presumption of employment, and critically, B, if the worker is doing the same thing as the employer, as the hiring entity, if they're in the same business, then that person is a worker and not an independent contractor. And so the companies, again, using their significant structural and instrumental and discursive powers, tried to create a carve-out for themselves from this law. But instead, in 2019, the California legislature signed or passed AB 5, which put the decision that the California Supreme Court made in Dynamics, put it into the laws of California. Now, you all are probably familiar with this law because it ended up impacting many freelancers inadvertently in the journalism world in an attempt to sort of help them. But there has now been an amendment that is set to alleviate the stressors that it's put on freelance journalists, and to really, specifically stay targeted at large corporations that are misclassifying their workers. And so in August, so just last month, a California judge said that Uber and Lyft have been violating employment and labor laws, that their workers are employees, and that they should be at least provided with a wage floor and overtime compensation. And that, in fact, if you extend what the judge decided, that drivers in California are owed billions of dollars in back wages, because many people in this economy are making less than the minimum wage, are actually sometimes losing money, especially in the pandemic context where demand is so low. So can I get I can share my own screen. Oh, I'm not allowed to. Here, stay here. Proposition 22 is the most expensive proposition that has ever existed in the history of the United States. It's $188 million. And what the companies have done is flood the airwaves, flood drivers' apps, flood consumers' email boxes to convince California voters that this is good for workers. Let me explain to you what it does. So on the left is what drivers, all workers in California get, and on the right is what Prop 22 gives them. So the most critical thing that Prop 22 does is it removes time-based wage protections. So workers will only get paid for time when they have a rider assigned to them, which puts them at pre-pandemic time period when demand was high, puts them at earning roughly $5 an hour. So it is a roughly $5 an hour hourly guarantee. There is no sick leave. There is no workers' compensation in an industry that OSHA says is one of the most dangerous in America. There is no unemployment insurance. You have to work roughly 60 to 70 hours a week to get any healthcare subsidies, but there is no health insurance. There is no paid family leave and no protections for health and safety, again, in what is one of the most dangerous occupations in America. What I think is really not well understood by the voting public is that although it seems like this would only apply to Uber and Lyft drivers, Instacart, DoorDash, Uber Eats, Postmates, it actually has the potential to extend well beyond this industry to across the delivery economy. So anyone who is doing delivery work, if the company decides to go to create an app essentially, then and deploy. He was just lying about what Prop 22 does. He kept saying that Prop 22 gives workers 120% of the minimum wage. That is not true. Prop 22 gives workers 120% of the minimum wage only for engaged time. So only for time that people have someone assigned to them. During the pandemic, that time was about 20% of the time that people were spending on the app. So people who were driving, spending their gas, paying for hybrid insurance, wearing and tearing on their car, they were actually losing money when they were driving, all said and done. They also have been saying that there's Black Lives Matter chapters that support them, and that's just not true. The chapters themselves have said that is not true, and so really they keep saying that hundreds of thousands of people will lose their jobs, which also is not true because their numbers are based on the number of people who start working on the platform and then then quit within 4 months, 70% of people, because this is such poorly remunerated work. So this is a real attempt to permanently lower labor costs. This would be permanent, and I'll tell you why it would be permanent. Because, and can you give me the next slide, please? Oh, okay, never mind. You can close the slides now. The reason that it would be permanent is because it has this unheard of measure, which says that it would take 7/8 of the California legislature to amend any portion of the proposition. So it would be effectively impossible for Californians, consumers, workers, the legislature, if they decide something is not working, it would be virtually impossible to amend it. And so future generations, or in few years, if things change and we want to provide paid sick leave to workers in this economy, or we want to provide health insurance to workers in this economy, that would be impossible. It also prevents local regulators from regulating for these companies. So
Veena, I'm so sorry. We want to have time for reporters to ask questions, and I apologize.
That's okay.
So
I will. You want me to answer the questions that are in the chat?
Projects, and I'm happy to answer questions about both of them. But I'm doing research right now that's funded by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, looking at elite gig workers, so workers who make at least $100 an hour or $1,000 a day. And then what I'll be mostly talking about today, actually, is a National Science Foundation, NSF funded study looking at the impact of COVID on precarious and gig workers, specifically in New York. I chose New York because it was an early epicenter of the virus, and I'm in New York right now. So extra bonus round there. My study looking at COVID on gig workers is a longitudinal project. So I did about 200 interviews with some grad students beginning in April and going through July. And then we will be following up with those same workers later this fall to look at the longer term impacts of COVID on their livelihoods, on their professional futures, on them socially and emotionally. And I will hold most questions until the end, but yes, the $100 an hour gig workers are doing management consulting. I call it McKinsey meets the gig economy. So it's a very different type of gig work. Right now, quite frankly, is not a good time to be a gig worker. Many gig workers are very vulnerable. They're in jobs that carry a high risk of exposure to COVID because they are often working in close proximity with strangers, whether they are driving strangers in their personal cars or being asked to go into a stranger's private home to do, for instance, TaskRabbit organizing or cleaning work. We've also seen that gig workers are in jobs that have been especially vulnerable to a massive decrease in demand. So we saw this, of course, with Uber and Lyft drivers, but also other gig workers. So dog walkers saw most of their business dry up. TaskRabbit workers who were doing cleaning, who were doing personal errand running or personal assistant work, their work dried up. Airbnb hosts,